Radio Mises, avsnitt 66. Denna gång blir det snart engelska igen för att vi har talat med Jeff Deist som är president för det amerikanska Mises-Institutet. Men jag kan säga hej till Klaus. Hej Klaus.
Hej Hans.
Ytterst kort introduktion på svenska. Amerikanska Mises-Institutet är ju som sagt mycket större än det svenska Mises-Institutet och startades 3 decennier sedan snart tror jag. Owner and proprietor är ju Lew Rockwell naturligtvis. Och Jeff Deist tog över för 1,5 år sedan som president. Det är alltså han som driver verksamheten nu. Utan att säga mer än så, varsågoda. With us today we have Jeff Deist, who is the current president of the Mises-Institute. That will be the American Mises-Institute, of course, based in Auburn, Alabama, not the Swedish Mises-Institute, which is sort of something like a small frontier outpost here in the wilderness of Scandinavia. Hello, Jeff.
Hello. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you with us. How about you, Jeff? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I come to you, I guess, through having met Joachim from Mises Sweden at Hans Hoppe's event every year in Bodrum, Turkey. So I think that's how I connected with you two and with your audience. How I came to be at the Mises-Institute is basically a long story. I guess I've known Lew Rockwell, who I'm sure you're familiar with, for 10 years or so. I worked for Ron Paul in the past. I've known Ron Paul since 1988 when I was a college student, an undergraduate. I went and saw him speak when he was running for president as a Libertarian Party candidate. So I guess I'm lucky in that even as a teenager, my older brothers were already quite libertarian in their thinking. So I was introduced to Hayek and the Road to Serfdom, and that sort of thing at a pretty early age, and then just developed through there. But I never intended to work at the Mises-Institute or have libertarian activism as a career. It's just something that happened quite by accident. I'm a lawyer, and I was intending to work as a lawyer, I suppose, my whole life. So it's really just through knowing Ron Paul, and then through Ron getting to know Lew Rockwell, that I've come to work at the Mises-Institute. So I'd love to tell you I have this great plan, but no plan. It just happened.
We love no plan.
It's interesting. Many of us in Sweden, libertarianism sort of came on a broader front to Sweden when Ron Paul popped up on YouTube in 2008. Many of us, the Swedish libertarian movement is very young, so to speak. But the common denominator is often Ron Paul, interestingly enough.
Well, that's true in the U.S. as well.
Yeah. So you were recruited by Lew then to this position as president?
In a sense, I suppose I was. But, I've known about the Mises-Institute for a long time, and it's one of the most radical organizations in the world, at least from my perspective. So I knew that if I came here, I would never be asked to compromise or sell out. Lew is not the kind of person who would ever want or allow the Institute to soften its message or dilute it in any way. So I didn't have any fears about coming here as an anarcho-capitalist. I knew that it would be a good fit. So I'm quite happy. The biggest adjustment for me was moving to the South in America, which has actually turned out to be great. It's a lot more rational here, and I fear that what's happening in some Swedish cities is also starting to happen in some U.S. cities. So, in a sense, I'm sort of glad to be out of the more populated parts of America.
Interesting. We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that.
What about your? How is it to have a sort of a lawyer career as a freedom-loving person?
Well, it was always a good fit for me because when I was a younger guy, I had certain strengths and weaknesses like we all do. And I think I figured out at some point that physics and chemistry and calculus were probably not my strength. So I gravitated to a career more with rhetoric and debate and argument. I think that was natural for me. And I early on decided, look, I'm either going to defend criminals against the state because whether the criminal has done something wrong or not, either way, the state has no legitimate authority to be prosecuting him. So, and then I thought, well, I think I'll go into tax because, if you're a tax attorney, your client is always correct, right? There's no such thing as a legitimate tax. There's no such thing as cheating on your taxes because it's theft. It's a shakedown. So it dovetailed for me. I do get that question a lot. A lot of people think that being a libertarian and an attorney is some sort of contradiction. I guess I don't see it that way. I always saw it as I would help my client against the state.
Yeah, there are two sides to that kind of industry, I suppose, if you're on the state side or on the...
Yeah, and to be fair, in the U.S. at least, many, many lawyers are terrible. Most lawyers want more government. They want more regulation. They are very left-wing. It's a terrible profession in that sense, so I certainly understand that.
Interesting.
Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening at the Mises, the American Mises-Institutet? I've noticed you've been doing your Mises circles and so on, and there's the annual Mises Academy, of course. Is there anything else going on? Anything new?
Well, we're really trying to find our way in this new hyper digital age. I mean, even just 5 years ago, let's say in 2010. If you were a real Rothbardian, Hoppian, Misesian, anarcho-capitalist, Mises.org was probably your primary source of finding this kind of literature, meeting like-minded people. But just in the 5 years that have gone by, there's been such a proliferation of websites and social media. So we're in sort of a new era now. If you're interested in Austrian economics, you can find virtually anything online either for free or at very low cost. There's no longer much of an excuse for anyone in the world to have not discovered Austrian economics if they were seeking it. Whereas, even 10 or 20 years ago, it was actually hard to find the written material. So all that has changed. So now we're in an era where we have to fight sort of a guerrilla-style war. And we have to say, with our limited resources, what's the best way to go about spreading things? And we've found that expanding our website, creating a new website, and having as much content on there for free is sort of the underpinning. That's the foundation. But beyond that, it's funny, but we're finding that in a digital world, and I know this applies universally, I think this is very human, in an increasingly digital world, the personal connections, getting to talk to people, getting to talk to you guys today, getting to meet people, especially at events, having students come here physically from Mises University creates a much deeper connection than just having people come to a website or just having people consume social media. It really is still a revolution. It's a revolution of ideas, but it's also a revolution of individuals. And when you actually meet people, when Hoppians get from Germany meet Hoppians from Sweden and from the UK and from the US, it's a much deeper and a better connection. And ultimately, it's better for the movement. So, as much as we're trying to be the best online source for Austrian material and anarcho-capitalist material, we're really on the other side of it trying to increase our amount, the number of conferences and classes and that sort of thing we have to really try to create more personal connections, because that's where it is. I mean, we're never going to be the majority. We're never going to have the numbers. So we better have the connections, and we better be better organized. That's my perspective.
It's almost countercultural strategy. Everyone else wants to be more and more digital, but we've sort of already reached digital platforms are here and has been here for a long while. So I find it very interesting. I totally agree, by the way. I think that people need to meet in real life, and any sort of movement, so to speak, has to meet in real life. You can't have a 100% digital movement because there's... I mean, the internet is sort of a layer between people. It can never be exactly the same as talking to people in person. And often I find that arguments and debates are much more alive in person than they can ever be in a digital context.
Yes, I agree.
So you've been the president for a year and a half now?
About a year and a half, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's been some change after you came on board. You had a conference recently on political correctness.
Yes,
which we very much appreciated. We looked at all the talks there, and that's a bit new to me for coming from the Mises-Institutet.
Yeah, well, people think of us more in terms of economics and Austrian material, so it's true. But when we go out and have conferences, we're trying to have subjects that are more topical and meaningful to people. And of course, when at least in the U.S., our perception is that Sweden is very, very PC, worse than here. Whether that's true or not, I'll leave to you. But I'll tell you what, people are very worried. The thing about PC is it affects every other issue. Unless and until we fight back against PC, we can never speak openly and honestly about anything, about politics, about economics. If we have this filter and if we have this muzzle that applies to all discourse or debate, we can't discuss things honestly. So to me, PC is a very, very important topic, and it's one where we can get beyond left and right and make new friends. Just amongst we've reached the point where it's not left versus right; it's reasonable people versus unreasonable people. And let's make sure that Austrian economics and sound money, and let's make sure that we're part of the reasonable people.
Just to confirm your Sweden bias, PC in Sweden is even worse than you could ever imagine. And what you're saying is so true in a Swedish context right now, because we're sort of running into a major political disaster here in Sweden. You've heard about the migrant crisis in Europe. Well, it's at its worst in Sweden because everyone wants to go to Sweden. So basically, politicians have been running blind into this because PC says you can't talk about the nation state and migration and these kind of things. So now we have a full-blown crisis. And not until, parts of government start breaking down can you actually talk about these things. It started happening the last few weeks that people actually dare talk about these things. But it takes almost a government breakdown to break PC in Sweden.
And it's by no means broken.
No. Just cracks in the surface, sort of.
Yeah.
Well, it's terrifying because to have huge sort of macro problems is bad enough, but to not even be able to talk about what to do in an open fashion, these are scary times. And they're scary times. The U.S. is right there. We're right there with Europe. We don't kid ourselves that somehow these problems of very aggressive socialism, very aggressive open borders will be contained in Europe. So we're not foolish that way. But the point is that we have an opportunity. As governments are simply incapable of doing the basic things that they claim to be able to do, and as that becomes more apparent to people, I think we have to seize that opportunity and say, there's an alternative. There are private means and private mechanisms to organize human affairs, where however imperfect would be much, much better than what we've got. And that's how we're going to move beyond left and right, beyond status and libertarian. I think we're moving into a time where it's going to be what works and what doesn't. And in most cases, we know that it's what's private works and what's government doesn't work. So no matter how indoctrinated or left-wing or hopeless a Swede might be, he or she is at some point going to see that, and I won't call this open borders, I'll call this state-sponsored forced migration, is not going to work in a country, as you told me earlier, is only 8 or 10 million people.
Right.
No, I mean, the Swedish welfare state is coming down, probably because of this. It's actually going to crash. We're not going to have... Libertarians often dream of the welfare state slowly dissolving and everybody, realizing it doesn't work. You sort of gradually pick it down part by part and so on. But that's not going to happen in Sweden. We're going to have large open conflicts over who gets what, and all the funding for most things are going to gradually be cut, and there's going to be, we're going to see the disturbing way a welfare state can collapse in. Maybe not, not this year or the next year, but in the coming 10 or 15 years, it's going to collapse.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it will be sooner. Because we're not just raising the temperature on the frog slightly. It's increasing pretty fast. So people are noticing.
Yeah, there's a lot of anger in Sweden right now. They're actually setting fire to asylum centers, which people did in Sweden in the 90s, to be honest, too. But it's becoming a bit scary to live in Sweden.
Well, what's sad about this is that the left progressives claim to be for the community, that they're communitarian, that they want us to work together in a happy, peaceful way, and that's why they're socialists, right? And what we find is the exact opposite. Socialism is exceedingly divisive. It sets people at each other's throats because they're all yoked together economically. And in fact, what creates happy, prosperous, functioning societies is trust, and high trust societies like the kind of private societies that Hoppe talks about. It's what we find is that the marketplace and that private industry is what creates cooperation and community among people along natural lines, whatever those might be. And it's this forced artifice run by the state, this forced yoking us all together that creates conflict and division. And what we fear is increasingly going to be actual bloodshed and war.
Yeah, I believe we will see more of that. We already have, rampant crime and rape and all kinds of stuff. And it's interesting. I think in Sweden, there's a liberal movement. There has been, of course, for a long time. And then there's the Mises movement.
Maybe we should clarify. I mean, in Europe, liberal used to mean the classical liberalism, not the American liberalism. Yeah. And then it sort of shifted. So Swedish liberalism is now like American liberalism. There's almost no classical liberalism left in Europe.
So social liberalism. So we have this idea among liberals of open borders being the liberal thing, being the libertarian thing. And how do you, as an anarchist, libertarian, consider open borders? Is that the libertarian idea?
Well, it's a very tough question simply because, what we talk about as an ideal is a society that doesn't have borders, it has property lines, right? And a private society has private property and property lines. And so instead of citizens and non-citizens and natives and immigrants, what you have is you have owners and you have residents and you have guests and invitees, and you have trespassers, right? The whole concept of immigration would be very radically different in a private type society. But we don't have that. So the question for libertarians today, given the reality in Sweden, given the reality in the US, is what should be the libertarian position on immigration? So a lot of libertarians, especially left libertarians, but a lot of libertarians say, well, okay, it's bad that we have governments in charge of borders, which are artificial, and it's bad that we have governments in charge of welfare, which creates a perverse incentive for immigrants. But let's not compound that error by having a bad restrictive government immigration policy. Let's let people go where they want to go because that's a measure of human freedom. And I disagree with this. We do have government, we do have the state, and as a result, we have public spaces and public areas. We can call it the tragedy of the commons. And when you've got public spaces and public areas in a non-libertarian society, the question becomes, well, what's the libertarian approach to what government ought to do? And it seems to me, and certainly Hoppe has laid this out better than anyone, that the government ought to try to safeguard the rights and the benefits of the real owners in the area, right? And that would be the property owners who don't want to see the public streets destroyed, who don't want to see the public treasury destroyed by welfare payouts and by perverse incentives that often attract the wrong kind of people, not hardworking people with money and skills, but rather people who don't want to work, who don't have skills, who are perhaps commit more crime and become permanent welfare recipients. I mean, that's the opposite of what a private system of capitalism would have. So if we're going to have government, and if we're going to have public spaces, then at least the least the government could do, it seems to me, is to try to protect those public spaces and keep them nice for the private actors who live in the country. So, I don't want to see immigration run the way it is in the U.S., and I don't want to see, it's not my place. Now, here's the difference between me and a left libertarian. I would never tell Sweden what the hell to do. Okay? I'm not like George Bush, where I want to go remake the Middle East. And I don't want to remake Sweden. I want Swedes to decide what happens in Sweden. Okay? I'm a localist. I'm a decentralizer. So, it would be presumptuous for me to say how things ought to be in Sweden. But I will say that what you're doing is probably not going to work out very well because it's all the wrong incentives. And how could it be otherwise? We know what private property means, and we know what public welfare means. Okay, this is not rocket science. So if I think left libertarians are wrong on this point. I think there is a libertarian case for government, provided we still have government, to at least try to protect private property. If government is to have any function whatsoever, which I don't think it does, but if it's going to have any function whatsoever, surely that function ought to be protecting private property.
I see state borders as a bad approximation of property borders. So at least they should try to,
There's a Hoppian argument about, I think I read it in Democracy, the God That Failed, or one of Hoppy's books, about what to do if you dismantle the state. What's your next move? Well, your move is to return all the stolen property to the original owners, wherever they can be found, if they can be found. And I mean, according to that argument, very much of what we see around us, which is publicly owned, to some part belongs to those of us who pay taxes. So, I mean, one could argue that those who pay, the more taxes you pay, the higher part of ownership do you have in what's now called the commons. So you should have more right to decide what happens to it. Of course, in this unperfect world, not in a perfect world, but those doesn't exist. So I mean, that's almost the same argument, since we taxpayers basically own what, even if it's the taxes are stolen from us and the government goes and spends it on whatever they want, whatever they spend it on is in some way owned by us.
Absolutely, it ought to be, but in fact, the main facet of ownership is control, and the state, not the people, controls government property.
That's the big problem, I guess. That's why we don't like the state.
Here's a question. How can you have problems like this in the US? Because everybody who wants to go to the US and work knows that it's almost impossible to get in. So where does this immigration come from in the US?
Well, it comes primarily from Central America and Mexico to our south. And it's very, very difficult for, let's say, a Swiss or a German or a Swede to come to America and get a work visa, and then later on get what's called a green card, which allows them to stay permanently and work, and then later on become a resident. It's very, very difficult to do this legally. It's much easier if you're from a southern nation and you simply do it illegally, simply enter the U.S., because we have a very, very long border. It's like 1,800-mile long border to our south. So it's actually easier to come here illegally. As far as legal immigration comes, Europeans are disfavored. It's easier to come here if you are from a Middle Eastern or African country, because there are certain rules about what countries have priority. For instance, after the Vietnam War, we gave priority status to many Vietnamese refugees. And right now we're giving priority status to certain Middle East refugees. And I suppose in a sense that's just because we're the ones who blew up the Middle East. So we're the ones who ought to be cleaning it up. But, nonetheless, if you are, if you're just a Swede and you say, hey, I'd like to go to the U.S., it's not as easy as you might think.
Now, Klaus, how did you get in?
Yeah, we want to know.
Yeah.
Friends, contacts.
Oh, right. You have contacts, high governmental contacts.
Well, yes, you can have an employer can sponsor you, and you can get a work visa, but there's quite a bit of work. You have to have particular skills, and let's not forget, none of these rules apply to elites. If you're very wealthy, you come live in America or go live wherever you want. This is just for the rest of us who have to deal with this.
It strikes me as so illogical. Why would you make it really hard for people to come and work in any country, harder than it is to come and not work? I mean, why does the state do this?
You mean is the state evil or stupid?
Yeah, but I mean, even if it's stupid, it can't be that stupid. Maybe it can, I suppose.
Well, it creates a huge constituency for more government. And the problems it causes, not only do you have new voters, because even people who enter the U.S. illegally do oftentimes become voters, whether legally or illegally. But it also creates a constituency for more government because you have to deal with the problems that. This is no criticism, but let's face it, at least the first couple generations of immigrants are usually quite poor, because if you're middle class or rich, you don't tend to leave your native country. You tend to leave your native country if you're quite poor because you're seeking a better life. And that's a noble thing. That I have no problem with that. But the reality is that the first generation of immigrants is usually quite poor. And as a result, they certainly contribute to the economy. Most Hispanic immigrants in the U.S. are hardworking. But they do create stresses on the welfare state. And, in economics, we call that an externality, right? Left libertarians want to act as though there are no externalities pertaining to mass immigration. That's just not true. Immigrants do cost taxpayers money. So it's a very strange time and very strange place in America. I'm not sure that everybody who likes Trump or everybody who wants to close the borders, is some horrible racist, xenophobic nativist. It's just not true. I mean, they're oftentimes just practical people who are looking around them and seeing these problems, and closing the borders may not be the solution, but it's certainly understandable why some people think it might be. And I think we ought to stop demonizing them. I'm really sick of this. I'm really sick of anyone, but especially libertarians of all people, for sort of treating the average guy with such contempt, like we're this intellectual movement that's above the average Joe, and the average Joe is so stupid and hasn't thought this out thoroughly. I don't agree with that. I think libertarianism ought to have bourgeois values, and I think libertarianism ought to be very common sense based. I think it ought to be something that flows from natural law and natural order, both of which are quite lacking in the statist order we have.
You mentioned high trust before. Sweden used to be almost unique in the Western world when it came to trust. Had a very, very high trust. You walked out in the street and you didn't expect to get, attacked or anything. But that has changed.
People left their doors unlocked, 20, 30, 40 years ago. People didn't even lock their doors. Well, in some parts of the country, obviously they did, but it was fairly unique. So we're told, at least.
Yeah.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and we sort of almost have to ask about Donald Trump. I mean, we're sort of enjoying the show from over here as well. I mean, Donald Trump is stirring things up quite a bit. And why do so many people like Donald Trump? Is it because he is, a straight talker and he talks, to regular people? Are people sort of fed up with regular politicians?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's far from a libertarian, and I never encourage voting. But the thing about Trump is he appeals to Americans that are very sick of a political class. All these consultants and people, the media, people around the whole political process are very, they're very much ensconced in Washington, D.C., and they don't deal with regular Americans. And they tend to have pretty nice lives compared to regular Americans, and they tend to be insulated financially. So people are quite tired of this. And, Trump is a uniquely American character, right? I mean, he's just so American. This is a country where we like people who are bombastic and people who flaunt their. I mean, this is a country where, we like Charlie Sheen, we like Elvis, we like Donald Trump. This is very different from let's say Scotland, when we talked about their recent Reformation to become independent. Scots, nobody in Scotland wants to appear more wealthy than anyone else. Everyone wants to be sort of modest. So there's something uniquely American about Trump, a very sort of the showman, P.T. Barnum style. Now, does that mean that it's good for politics? I don't know, but at this point, anything that took us away from the inevitability of Bush versus Clinton, my God. So when people call him a clown, I love how Hillary's not a clown. She's somehow a serious person because she married Bill Clinton and because there's nothing serious about them. Politicians are clowns. They're the clowns. So, Trump may be outlandish, but he's put his own money on the line many a time. So I find it refreshing. I want the political class to suffer, and I want people to laugh at the political class. And if Trump accomplishes that, then that's a victory.
Yeah,
it's one of the things we like most when people laugh at politicians. That's actually something we try to do a lot. I mean, the Swedish Mises-Institutet is a fairly small outpost in the Scandinavian wilderness, but what we do try to do all the time is make people laugh at politicians and point out where they're so hilariously wrong and, thick-headed. And we've found actually that people connect to this, even in Sweden. People don't like politicians here either. They'll go vote for the lesser evil, but people actually like making fun of politicians. And I there's something hopeful in that.
Absolutely. There is something hopeful in that because politicians don't know better. They're just average people or worse. They're oftentimes worse than average people. So you never want to see blind faith. And if Swedish people are starting to say we can't have blind faith in the system anymore, then that's a start.
Yeah.
For many years, I've been talking about the demographic crisis of Sweden. Of course, people don't have so many kids anymore. They're too busy with other things, I suppose. So we needed all this immigration to make up for that and to save the welfare state. So this was sold as a huge, incredible investment for the future, to have this influx of, people who can hardly read and write. And now it's been turned around. Now it's breaking the back of the welfare state completely. So it's no longer such a great investment. And now it's a big humanitarian project. And Sweden has been declared to be a humanitarian superpower.
It's an interesting cognitive dissonance where when the truth suddenly turned 180 degrees. I mean, all sound people knew that taking care of refugees costs money, but the political class has actually started making a 180 turn and hoping that nobody will notice, which we obviously will point out until the day we die because it's so hilarious to see them squirm.
Yeah.
But there are two topics, if we have time, I would like to bring up, if you have time, Jeff.
Sure, absolutely.
First, shortly, you wrote an article, which I actually translated, about Ross Ulbricht, the proprietor of Silk Road, and discussed his, fate. And, I mean, he was sentenced to life in prison, I think.
Indeed.
Yeah, and you sort of outlined there that, Ross Ulbricht is... well, of course, I mean, he was providing services that were illegal but shouldn't be illegal, drugs and so on, etc. But at the same time, we should not, if I understood your article correctly, you wanted to make a case also for, regular people doing regular economic transactions, and that, the agorism isn't always the answer. You can't just hope that everyone will start doing black market economics and that'll save the world.
Yeah, I got a lot of grief for that article. a lot of people wrote me saying they did not like that article, which is interesting. I guess the point here is that, obviously this poor young man should not be in jail. And obviously people should be able to buy and sell whatever they care to buy and sell online and ingest whatever they ingest. And he was not at all involved in any kind of drug trafficking, money laundering. All he did was provide a platform by which, people may or may not do things that are currently illegal. But that's no different than the phone book, right? You could be in the phone book and provide people a way to communicate with each other, and then they take that way to communicate and do something illegal. So it's an absurdity that this young man is in jail. My question is that there was so much sort of libertarian love for this guy, and there's so little love for the average businessman who just goes about his day and deals with all the regulations and cuts the corners where he can and evades taxes where he can, but actually employs people and lives in the real world. I mean, we cannot have a movement that's based on, hey, we should all be able to buy heroin. Well, yeah, we should all be able to buy heroin, but if we all buy heroin, we're going to spend a lot of time laying around on the couch, and we're not going to spend much time building a civilization, right? I mean, let's be glad our great-grandparents did not spend their time buying heroin. Instead, they spent their time building physical, literal buildings and building literal physical roads and building institutions that have made us rich in the West. So there's kind of this bias in libertarianism towards black markets. And the thing about black markets is the markets are created and they are lucrative solely because of the state's silly prohibitions, right? So in a sense, black market profit is artificial. It's larger than it would be if you could simply go into CVS and buy some heroin. CVS is a drugstore chain in the U.S. I don't necessarily see Russ Ulbricht as a hero. I see him as a victim. A hero is someone who creates. He created a workaround and a platform. But if all it's used for is for people to buy and sell drugs, let's say, which is what he was accused of facilitating, then okay, great, knock yourself out and use drugs if you want to use them. I couldn't care less. But boy, I want libertarianism to be about more than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid point. I mean, as a movement of ideas, the only idea can't be everyone should be able to do everything all the time. I mean, we have to sort of focus on what's important. The important thing is, we want a civilization. We like civilization, and the state is the largest threat to our civilization, and that's one of the reasons we dislike it so much. That all the things we hold dear will eventually become ground down by the state.
I think it's interesting to see here also the court system, the judicial system. To me, it's all arbitrary if you're convicted or not. We had a similar case in Sweden for a site called the Pirate Bay, where they provided BitTorrent links to files. People could download movies and music and whatever. And the whole case was just a joke. To me, that was the same thing as Google. Google provides links too.
Yeah, they did something like Google, yeah, and they got convicted and fines that were like, I don't know, ridiculous. The fines were ridiculous. I mean, hundreds of millions of Swedish kroner for providing links to files people could download. But that was a political trial. There's no arguing that was a trial.
Same with this one. It's based on feels more than laws and rational
life
thinking.
In prison. How did he get life in prison?
Well, I mean, first the prosecutors smeared him and his reputation. They brought a phony charge against him that he had solicited a murder for hire to go after a business competitor. They threatened him with this charge. Of course, that charge was later dropped because there was no evidence. But that charge was completely bogus. But what it did was it scared that, out of Ross Ulbricht because he thought, oh my gosh, with this charge of soliciting murder, my potential sentence in prison is much, much higher. So I think it made him much more pliable for some sort of confession. So it was a very dirty tactic by the prosecutors.
All right, very sad story. But we liked your article so much that we translated, and we actually caught some flack as well for translating it. So, final topic, for whatever time we have left. I mean, we have to talk a little bit about the economy, and I would like to pose the question as this. I mean, we all know that the U.S. economy, the world economy, there are some serious issues, but if we compare the economy now to, say, 30 or 40 years ago, the world economy, when China was still heavily communist, now it's quasi-communist, I don't know. And I mean, there has been improvements. The economy is still sort of moving in the right direction in some parts of the world.
Well, I suppose so. If you look at China, imagine a little kid who grows 6 or 12 inches in just a year. And you say, oh my gosh, little Jimmy grew 12 inches. That means by the time he's 20, he's going to be 18 feet tall. No. Someone took a boot off their neck, and so capitalism, which always just existed in the cracks in China, in the black market, is now more robust, and hence they've had very rapid growth. But they have very serious structural problems in China. Not least among them is the one-child policy, which created a surplus of men and too few marriageable women. Is going to be a big problem because, huge amounts of young unemployed men is never good for an economy. So they've got a lot of problems, and they're still very closed and still very narrow-minded. So this fear of China in the West is just so absurd. There are vast parts of China which are almost medieval. I mean, there are vast parts of rural China which barely have electricity, much less internet. And their cities are congested and all kinds of problems. So, God bless the Chinese. I hope they I hope they become fully capitalist someday. But this ludicrous narrative amongst the Western neoconservatives that China is a threat, militarily or otherwise, is just nonsense.
Now, so you're basically saying it's gotten a bit better simply because they stopped shooting people who tried to trade. And they're brilliant, hardworking people, and they're savers. They save money. The gold is flowing into China while it's flowing out of the West. So they're tougher than us. We're soft and we're weak in the West. So let's not discount a work ethic. That alone can take you a long way, even with a bad political system. Oh, absolutely. But the main question is, what I'm getting at, perhaps, is this. I mean, us libertarians tend to be a bit doom and gloomers. The economy is going to go to pot in the US and Europe at some point. But I mean, how bad a shape is the world in? I suppose is what I'm trying to get at.
Well, it's a good question. We've never had a time in the history of the world where a global reserve currency, something that the whole world basically uses for money, called the U.S. dollar, was threatened. We've had instances in history where we could look at Weimar Germany, where we could look at Argentina more recently, and see what happens within a country, a contained country, when their currency collapses. But we've never had a situation where there's been such excessive debt creation that's underpinned by the U.S. dollar. And what we're going to find out is whether that dollar can be propped up simply because of military might or simply because of OPEC having to buy oil using dollars, or simply because the Chinese and central banks hold so many U.S. dollar denominated treasuries that they don't want to just dump them all at once because the value will go down and they'll lose their shirts. It's very odd, Hans, because on the one hand, it is in the rest of the world's interest. It's in Russia's interest, China's interest, Brazil's interest, India's interest to have the dollar fall. and stop being used as the world's reserve currency. It's clearly in their long-term interest. But in the short term, it would be very, very tough for them if the dollar fell because they hold dollars. So it's like musical chairs. We're waiting to see who's going to be the first to sit down. Look, if I knew the answer to your question, I would be out there getting rich. Okay. But it's the hubris. It's this ego that says we can control economies. We can micromanage the economic choices of billions of economic actors by sitting at the Fed and tweaking interest rates one way or the other. That's what's going to get us all killed, is that sort of hubris.
What about the softness that you mentioned? We've become soft. Why?
Well, because it's materially we can kind of sit on our couches and have social media and it can be a very easy life. At least in most of the West, utilities are pretty cheap, food's pretty cheap, clothes are pretty cheap, housing's not so cheap anymore. And if you look at, I can only speak for the U.S. If you look at the generation that suffered through the Great Depression, which is in the 1930s in the U.S., most of them are now dead. 80% of Americans were agricultural farmers at the time. So they could produce chickens and crops, and they could oftentimes live with very little money. They could produce at home much of what they needed just to survive. You fast forward now 85 years, and the whole world is so interconnected by just-in-time delivery systems of food, of cash to your ATM, of electricity to run the servers. Most people now use their phone to pay for everything. Everything is so much more fragile today. It's so much more complex, and when complex systems crash, the effect is spread farther than it is in the 1930s when the U.S. may have been suffering, but Argentina wasn't necessarily suffering. This time around, the whole world's going to get the flu, and let's hope we can come to our senses and make it as short as possible, as opposed to dragging it out by printing money, which Japan has been doing since the 90s, since we've been doing since 2000. And it's not working.
We are definitely very comfortable, and it can be a rude awakening for many when, in Sweden, the rude awakening is coming when the government checks sort of start drying up bit by bit. And one could make an argument that it's never good for a country or a civilization to become so comfortable that you just sort of, you expect nice things to just come your way without making much of an effort. And that's a danger too. And I think politicians definitely are very affected by this. They think that the economy will magically continue to grow out of no reason at all. And they can just continue taxing and get more and more tax revenue every year to spend on their whatever they want to spend it on. So that could be a rude awakening. And people will have to get tougher to get through that.
But it's also the only way to get the monkey off our backs, because it will never back off voluntarily. I think it has to be starved and crashed. I think that's the only way.
Well, I agree. I don't think progressives will ever be defeated as long as we all sort of remain materially comfortable.
Right.
Everything works. There's food in the grocery. There's fuel at the gas station. But it's when things don't work that one of two things happens. It's a crisis. And crisis provides us with an opportunity to go back to sounder thinking and to decentralized approaches, or to fall prey on the flip side to some sort of more monstrous global government that comes in to try to fix things. So interesting times ahead. But we can't complain. For all of our, you said doom and gloom as libertarians. Most of us live unbelievably comfortable material lives compared to, let's say, our grandparents. Where we're impoverished is in our spirit, in our mentality. That's where we're poorer. That's when they had more than us. They had more grit.
Yeah, I think we're almost going to end at that note because that was such a nice final conclusion.
Perfect.
One more thing, really quick, Jeff. We usually do a book recommendation as our last order of things. Do you have any book at all you would like to recommend to our listeners?
Oh my gosh, there are so many.
Top of your head, any book.
Okay, well, I'm not going to give you, a standard libertarian or economics book. I will say, if you haven't read the Flashman series by George MacDonald Fraser, a Canadian writer who wrote a great series of historical novels starring a guy named Harry Flashman, you will absolutely enjoy them, and they are definitely not PC. I can put it to you that way.
Excellent.
Give us a short description. What are they about?
Well, so Harry Flashman is a fictional character who comes up in Victoria's England, Queen Victoria's England in the 1800s, and straddles into the early 1900s. So he is a cad, a womanizer, a drunk, a soldier, a coward on the battlefield, and he's an expert liar. So he finds himself in all these misadventures as part of the British Empire in India, in Afghanistan, you name it. He's in all these different battles. But so they provide sort of a revisionist history of the British Empire and how it's always sort of haplessly trying to control India or whatever with mixed results. And along the way, he meets quite a few ladies along the way. So it's great because there's just so little masculine fiction anymore. Great stuff. And George MacDonald Fraser passed away now, but he was a very anti-PC guy. And there's about 14 novels in the series. So when you're sort of tired of reading the news and reading econ and thinking about really, it's a great thing to just kind of give yourself the luxury of some enjoyable reading at bedtime.
Perfect.
Well, I guess that's it for this episode. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us and talking to us about this and that.
Thank you.
Always welcome to come back whenever you have time.
No, Jeff, you wanted to say something?
No, well, just, best to Mises Sweden, and, don't be a stranger. Please let me know if we can do anything to help, and please have me on again.
We certainly will do that.
Excellent. Well, thanks
you,
to our listeners. Thanks to Jeff. Thanks to Klaus. Thanks to everyone. This has been the best episode of Radio Mises yet. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, thanks, guy. That was fun. I enjoyed it.
Detta avsnitt är klippt och mixat av CF Ljud. För klippning, mixning eller ljudförbättring, ta kontakt med cfljud@gmail.com.